So for my PhD, start my research trips, go to Germany to the archives, expecting to find nothing, because that's what I had been told, right? That there was just simply no information on this topic. So you can imagine my surprise then when I ended up finding mountains and mountains of material. Letters and diaries from queer survivors, Allied military records talking about queer concentration camp survivors, post-war German judicial records, right? So you get the picture. There's a lot of different people leaving records behind about the Nazis' LGBTQ victims. So then that actually changed my research question, right? Okay, if there is this information, and it turns out that even a handful of German scholars had begun to research and write about this and publish about it, how could I, in 2005 to 2009, study it for 4 years and never learn about it? How had this information not made its way into mainstream Holocaust education? So what began as an interest into what happened to LGBTQ people in Germany from 1933 to 1945, a really nice kind of time frame, to the chagrin of my advisor, turned into a project about how was this group forgotten, and what are the implications of forgetting the suffering of an entire group of people. So the book ended up tracing or spanning almost 100 years and jumping 2 continents. So in order to tell that story, I decided to use a symbol that was at the heart of it all, which was the pink triangle. So tonight, before I can talk to you about the pink triangle's legacies, I need to tell you a little bit about the pink triangle's origins. Now, by the early or the late 1920s in Germany, there was a small fringe right-wing party called the Nazi Party that was slowly gaining more followers. In 1932, this party became the largest party in Germany, and as such, its leader, Adolf Hitler, was appointed chancellor of the country in January of 1933. And this new Nazi government sought to establish a racially pure society, a people's community built on this idea of the racially superior German people. And it labeled several groups who lived in Germany as not belonging to this new German society. Some of those groups, including primarily Jewish people, but also the Roma and Sinti, and people with disabilities, the Nazis believed that these groups of people posed such a basic biological racial threat to German society that they ultimately had to be removed from German society, also German land, and ultimately from life itself. Now, other groups that the Nazis also targeted as enemies, but they believed that these other groups could be forced to give up their beliefs or their behaviors. And that included folks like political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, several others, but also including the people that we would today recognize as LGBTQ. So the Nazis were obsessed with understanding and then controlling human sexuality. Right? They viewed this as literally the key to reproducing the next generation of the so-called master race. So the Nazis, which they're not quite unique in this belief, but the Nazis did not believe that people were born LGBTQ. They believed that it was essentially everyone was born straight and some people were seduced into a deviant homosexual lifestyle. And so the Nazis' policies remained focused on trying to re-educate LGBTQ folks to give up their lifestyle to be so-called normal, productive Germans again, or I should say reproductive Germans. Right? They believed that the main threat caused by the LGBTQ community is that they so-called robbed the fatherland of children, right, of the next generation of good Nazis. So one of the first things that the Nazis did when they came to power was try to control access to information. They banned all LGBTQ publications across the country. And in the famous book burnings of May of 1933, one of the largest bonfires that evening was compiled of approximately 20,000 unique books, journals, and artifacts from the Institute of Sexual Sciences, which was a world-renowned, unique organization that studied, documented the health, the culture, and the history of LGBTQ people. The Nazis also shut down the numerous bars, clubs, political organizations that LGBTQ people had built for themselves, first starting in Berlin as the capital city, but then in waves throughout the rest of the country. So the Nazis did target really anyone whose gender expression or sexual identity did not conform with their very narrow ideals. The Nazis essentially believed that transgender people or gender nonconforming people did not exist as a separate identity, that it was essentially straight people, so-called cross-dressing. And so they arrested a lot of transgender people under a law called Paragraph 183 that classified cross-dressing as essentially disturbing the peace. The Nazis also targeted lesbians, and they used a wide range of different laws to arrest them, or as was primarily the case, the Gestapo or the Nazis' secret state police would simply apprehend lesbians in what they called protective custody, which means that they actually didn't need any law in order to do that. But out of all of the LGBTQ community, the Nazis viewed queer men as the most dangerous. And that is because, like in most countries in the world at the time, it was men who had access to positions of authority, right, in the economy, in the military, in national politics. So therefore, any perceived deviance in men was more dangerous because they had more access to the everyday running of the government. So the biggest tool in the Nazis' toolbox was a law called Paragraph 175. This was a law that explicitly criminalized same-sex behavior between men, and the Nazis actually inherited this law. This was on the books since 1871, when Germany was first united as a country. But when you might be thinking like, okay, well, the Nazis must have felt really lucky to inherit this national law, didn't even have to write it themselves. But actually the Nazis felt that the way the original law was worded was too confining for them. So in 1935, which is the same year that they are writing the Nuremberg race laws, they amend Paragraph 175, and so you can see the new text of the law here on the screen. And what they do is criminalize indecency between men. And you might be thinking, I don't know if we have any law students or lawyers here, how do you legally define indecency? And that was actually the point. They wanted that word to be purposefully vague so that prosecutors and judges could interpret that essentially however they wanted to on a case-by-case basis, with the explicit goal of arresting or convicting as many queer men as possible. Now, one of the things that I have found most jarring in my research was the degree to which ordinary Germans supported the Nazis' homophobic and transphobic policies. The records indicate that ordinary Germans used their voice to activate the power and the violence of the Nazi state against queer people in staggering numbers. And in fact, out of all of the Paragraph 175 cases that ended in a conviction, 1/3 of those stemmed from civilian denunciations, right? So people's neighbors or bosses or landlords turning them in to the Nazis. In total, the Nazis arrested about 100,000 queer men under Paragraph 175. I will add that these were ethnically German and mostly non-Jewish. Because if a person was gay and Jewish, for example, the Nazis would have viewed their Jewish identity as the most heinous crime, and they would have been treated as a Jew. So these numbers that you see here are primarily non-Jewish Germans. You can see the incredible spike of the rate of annual convictions after the 1935 amendment of the law. And right now, we don't have comparable statistics for the number of queer women who were arrested because, as I mentioned, they were arrested under several different laws. So scholars I know of a handful of scholars who are working right now to try to compile all of this data so that we can get a more complete understanding of what happened to queer women in the Third Reich. But between 7,000 and 10,000 so-called repeat offenders, so these are men who were arrested more than once under paragraph 175, were sent to concentration camps. And any person who was brought into a concentration camp was labeled by the Nazi guards with a colored triangle that corresponded to the so-called crime of why they were being imprisoned. And gay men or queer men were labeled with a pink triangle, one like you see here. And this pink triangle actually was it was never used. It was picked up by American liberators of a concentration camp. It was in a stack of triangles that was ready to be used, and the T on the pink triangle, we guess is, well, in German, the T would be for Czech. So this would have been applied, or it was created for use on a gay Czech man. Lesbians and transgender people were also sent to the camps. They didn't have their own particular color triangle, but we know that they were most often marked with a black triangle. This was kind of an umbrella category that the Nazis used. It was called asocials or social deviants, and was used for a wide swath of prisoners ranging from sex workers to alcoholics, homeless people, as well as people like lesbians and transgender people. But we know from the historical record that pink triangle prisoners were subjected to harder work details because the Nazis viewed hard work as a man's job. And so it was viewed that if these queer men were forced to do something manly, it might make them kind of reorient to being straight again. But then the camp physicians were also undertaking incredibly violent and intrusive medical experiments on these men as a way to try to find a biological cure for the so-called disease of homosexuality. But I want to say that while the Nazis on paper had a policy of not mass murder of all gay people, instead trying to cure them or re-educate them, the numbers tell a different story. Out of all of the queer men who were sent to concentration camps, 66% of them were killed there. So over 2/3 of the men with the pink triangle died. Now, after the Allies liberated the concentration camps in May of 1945, they suddenly found themselves having to take care of hundreds of thousands of concentration camp survivors. So led by the Americans, the Allies adopted a policy of releasing people who had been imprisoned based on their race, religion, or political beliefs. But they said that it's too dangerous for us to release so-called common criminals back into the general population. And because the pink triangle prisoners had broken a national law, also because of homophobia within the Allied forces as well, they treated the men with the pink triangle as common criminals. So if any pink triangle prisoner who still had time left on their sentence, a sentence given to them by Nazis, the Allies would transfer them from the liberated concentration camp to a nearby prison where they were forced to serve the rest of their term. At the same time, the Allies were purging all Nazi laws from the German criminal code. Perhaps not surprisingly, they left paragraph 175 on the books. They said they would leave it up to the Germans to decide what to do with that law. So in 1949, East and West Germany are created. All right, East Germany, the communist half, decides from day one that they are going to get rid of the Nazi version and go back to the original 1871 version, which was a little more lenient. West Germany, the Democratic side, explicitly states that they want to keep the Nazi version of paragraph 175. So Pierre Ciel, who was a gay Frenchman who had been imprisoned during the German occupation, stated powerfully at the end of the war that liberation was only for others. But beginning immediately after the creation of West Germany, gay people in the country challenged paragraph 175 in court. They said that it went against the new democratic constitution for the country to continue using a Nazi version of an already discriminatory law. But West German courts continuously rebuked any claims that fascism lived on in the fact that they were using a Nazi law. In fact, in 1957, the West German Constitutional Court ruled once and for all that the country would keep the Nazi version of paragraph 175. And they didn't just keep it. It's not kind of one of those laws, right, that you hear that's been kind of forgotten on the books for 100 years that says, like, you can't walk on your left foot on the sidewalk or something like that. They kept it and they enforced it. And if you remember that graph that I showed you a couple of slides ago of the annual convictions, if you expand that to include the entire life of paragraph 175, this is what it looks like. Right, so goes down after the end of the war, but in 1949, when West Germany is created, that numbers go straight back up. In the first 20 years alone of West Germany's existence, they arrest 100,000 queer men with the Nazi version of paragraph 175, leading a historian and theologian named Hans Joachim Schoeps to claim in 1963 that for homosexuals, the Third Reich hasn't ended yet. Now, debates around the legality and constitutionality of paragraph 175 are not the only place where ordinary Germans discussed the Nazis' LGBTQ victims. The treatment that they suffered also came up around discussions of compensation. So what you see here on the screen is a letter from a German man named Bruno Bouchard, who was arrested under paragraph 175 and spent 4 years in prison. He survived the war, and afterwards he writes an application to be officially recognized as a victim of Nazism. And if he was recognized, this would make him eligible for financial reparations, legal aid and getting his record expunged, and general help in trying to rebuild his life in the shadow of the Holocaust. Now, Bruno's application was denied, and it was surprising to me, at least whenever I first found it in the archive. It stated explicitly, "We are denying this because we see that you were gay." Now, Bruno does something pretty rare. He appeals that decision. In fact, he appeals it again and again and again, leaving a really rare paper trail in the archives for a historian like myself to find. And what you're seeing here is one of those letters in which he appealed. And you can see down on the bottom of the first page, he's underlined a portion to really underline its importance. And so I've translated that for you here. And essentially, he tells the compensation board that the Nazis only allowed him to leave prison alive if he submitted to so-called voluntary castration. And he says that such a brutal intrusion on a healthy human body was only possible in Nazi Germany and should be enough to convince you that I was a victim of fascism. The compensation board was not convinced. They reject his claim again and then go a step further by calling the police on him, right? Because paragraph 175 is still in effect and it's still illegal. So now I want to show you a quick clip of a gay concentration camp survivor talking about his experience after the war. He goes on record only as Heinz F. For a documentary called Paragraph 175. This clip is about 3.5 minutes long. The audio is in German, but there will be English subtitles underneath it.
Wie lange sind Sie in Konzentrationslagern gewesen?
Zusammen, wir haben mal zusammengerechnet, ich glaube 8 Jahre.
Was haben Sie gemacht, als Sie zurückkamen?
Ja, und wieder nach Hause kamen. Ja, da bin ich ins Geschäft, elterliche Geschäfte gegangen. Das mein Bruder führte, mein Vater war Jungfrau.
Haben Sie Ihrem Bruder oder Ihrer Mutter erzählt, was passiert ist in den Lagern?
Ich habe mit meiner Mutter nie drüber gesprochen. Mit meinem Vater konnte ich darüber sprechen, aber
Warum nicht?
was war? Meine Mutter hat doch nie was gesagt. Das ist alles völlig getragen.
Aus Scham darüber?
Meine Mutter meinte, die Ausschau bestimmt. Oder aus überquellendem Mitgefühl vielleicht, um mir auch nicht zu beleidigen. Oder es mir noch schwerer zu machen. Nicht einfach, dass die
Heute ist es ganz schwer vorzustellen, dass sie diese schrecklichen Jahre überlebt haben und zurückkamen und
mit keinem drüber sprechen konnten. Ja. Hab nie mit jemandem drüber gesprochen.
hätten Sie gern mit jemandem darüber gesprochen?
Vielleicht. Vielleicht mit einem.
Haben Sie später mit anderen darüber sprechen können?
Nie. Es wollte auch keiner hören, wenn man bloß irgendein Stichwort sagt. Also ich bin mit dem Kram zufrieden. Ich habe noch vorbei und damit ist erledigt.
So a really powerful and moving clip from Heinz. But I think one of the things that makes Heinz's story more heartbreaking is that it's just one of thousands. So I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that folks had often told me that LGBTQ people were one of the so-called forgotten victim groups of the Nazi regime, but it becomes really clear pretty soon, if you look at the evidence, that no one forgot about these people. Ordinary German people knew what had happened to them, but unfortunately, in most cases, they agreed with it. Ordinary people continued to discriminate, and the German government continued to persecute this group. Some men, like Bruno, broke their silence and told their story, but those with more power and authority told him to be quiet, essentially because he was not a victim, but a criminal. The stifling environment of homophobia forced many men like Heinz here to keep his memories hidden, to never talk about them, even with his own family. So writing this book has taught me a lot about the nature of silence. And when I first started, I thought of silence as a noun, as the absence of something, the absence of sound or the absence of memories. But what we are seeing here is silence as a verb, right? To make someone quiet. West German politicians, judges, historians, journalists, and the general public had silenced the Nazis' LGBTQ victims for decades. But by the 1970s, thankfully, gay activists were about to break that silence once and for all. So in the summer of 1969, the West German parliament finally amended paragraph 175. They didn't get rid of it, but they got rid of the Nazi version. And this was not because they were pro-gay rights by any means. It was because too many people had accused them of not learning the lesson from their Nazi past. So this paved the way for the emergence of a politically active gay rights movement. So activists in this new movement sought to mobilize queer people across the country into political action. And during this time, again, this is early 1970s, the act of coming out or publicly claiming an LGBTQ identity was not just a personal decision, it was also a political tactic. So past activists in a movement had argued for the right to privacy. Right? They essentially said that the government should not persecute people, should not persecute LGBTQ people, as long as they stayed in the privacy and the safety of the metaphorical closet. But the politics of coming out asserted that citizens in a democratic society had every right to freely and openly express their sexuality. So West German gay activists suggested that they collectively out themselves by wearing a gay symbol. As you can imagine, that sparked a lot of debate about what is a gay symbol? How do you market a community as visibly gay? So in 1972, a publishing house in Hamburg released a really short book that ultimately came to have a monumental impact. Written under the pseudonym Heinz Hager, it was the very first book written by a gay concentration camp survivor to tell their story. And the title, which translated in English as The Men with the Pink Triangle, offered a solution to the problem of visibility. So these activists knew that West Germans would instantly recognize the pink triangle as a concentration camp badge and thus be faced with the fact that their recent history was not completely in the past. So in March of 1972, a leftist, communist, queer group in Frankfurt, Germany called Rot Schwul became the very first organization in the world to adopt the pink triangle as a symbol of gay liberation. Now, these West German activists knew that their reclamation of the pink triangle represented a fundamental transformation of both a symbol and an identity. The original pink triangle had labeled being queer as something subhuman, as criminal, right, as worth punishing. But they reclaimed it and said that being gay is in no way shameful. They robbed the symbol of its negative power by saying that being gay is not an insult anymore, and in fact, we're going to wear this symbol as a badge of pride. So during my research, I got to meet Peter Heidenstrom, who was one of these original members who first reclaimed the pink triangle. And he explained to me that, of course, the use of the pink triangle represented an individual's choice to come out, but in a much larger sense, it also represented, finally, a coming out of this chapter of history that had been kept in the closet for decades. Now, the reclamation of the pink triangle originated first in West Germany, but it didn't stay there for very long. In August of 1974, the Gay Activists Alliance in New York City designed and wore these pink triangle buttons in a protest there in New York City. That was the very first documented instance of the pink triangle's use in gay rights activism in the United States. From there, it spread all across the country. Gay activists used the pink triangle and the history that it represented to call out homophobia and to promote equality. They did so from New York, DC, Miami, across to San Francisco, and really everywhere in between. In America, too, gay activists understood their use of the pink triangle as something transformative, right? Transforming something that was negative into something that was powerfully positive. The Jewish and lesbian activist Martha Shelley also told me in an interview in her really characteristic grit that the pink triangle also had the added benefit of giving the middle finger to the Nazis. So by the early 1980s, the pink triangle had become the most widespread symbol of queer activism, not only in Germany, but also throughout North America. And it resonated with communities from multiple ethnicities and backgrounds, as well as multiple gender identities and sexual orientations. But in 1986, a group of activists and artists in New York City catapulted the pink triangle into public consciousness in a new way when they designed this now iconic Silence Equals Death poster, which was meant to motivate people into action during the deadly AIDS crisis. And after the AIDS activist group called ACT UP adopted the poster, the pink triangle became a visible symbol of activism across the world. But the pink triangle was never just about politics. Transgender activist Nancy Nangeroni used symbolism as a means of bridge building. So as she told me in an interview, there was a lot of homophobia in the trans community in the 1990s, just as there was a lot of transphobia in the gay community. So using her artistic skills, she wanted to design a button and t-shirts that combined the symbolism of the pink triangle as well as a transgender symbol as a way to try to bring these communities together. And intersectionality also prompted Jose Gutierrez to form Triangulo Rosa, which was a support group for Latino gay men in Washington, D.C. And Jose has since become a really dear friend, and he talks really passionately about what the pink triangle means to him as a Mexican American who doesn't have any direct connection to the pink triangle's origins in Germany. He said that he felt connected to it because the pink triangle had come to represent a queer community, in fact, a queer identity that transcended national borders and had a shared history. That shared history was incredibly important for Black and queer author Cheryl Head. She talked about the first time that she saw the pink triangle, at least in the US, was on that Silence Equals Death poster, but for her, it would not have been as powerful if she didn't already know the history behind the symbol. Unfortunately, that history was still outside the queer community, largely unwritten and under attack. Professional historians and museums and academic journals refused to study or fund or research the topic, and as late as 1996, which is what you can see here, a state archive in Hamburg got caught destroying case files on the Nazis' LGBTQ victims as a way to make way for what they called more archive-worthy material. So since the 1970s, a handful of grassroots scholars risked their reputations and their livelihoods to piece this history together. While there was a lot of silence and ignorance around the topic outside the queer community, it didn't mean that this history wasn't being written, because it was being written by the queer community itself. And to this day, it's still a very small group of us who are writing about and preserving this history, and my own book would not be possible without the work of the people that you see here on the screen. Now, in 2002, the unified German government finally recognized the men persecuted under paragraph 175 as official victims of the Nazi regime. That meant that they were finally also eligible for compensation. But in 2002, no gay men came forward. That's probably because at the time, the youngest would have had to have been at least in their mid-80s, right? And you can also imagine that for their entire lives, they had been told by several German regimes that their suffering was not worthy of recognition. So to this day, not a single LGBTQ survivor has received a penny of official compensation from the German government. So now we come to the conclusion of my talk this evening. Today, it's the rainbow flag, not the pink triangle, that's the most widespread symbol of the LGBTQ community across the globe. But in many ways, the rainbow was created as the antithesis of the pink triangle. In 1978, Harvey Milk and a San Francisco-based artist named Gilbert Baker wanted something with soul for the Gay Pride Parade that year. So Gilbert Baker said, quote, "We only have the pink triangle for our community. That comes from the Holocaust and Hitler. We need something uplifting and something happy." What he designed that year was the very first rainbow flag. And since then, the rainbow has come to have a level of recognition and visibility beyond the LGBTQ community that the pink triangle simply never did. But I would argue that it only became so widespread because it was tamed. In order for it to be more accepted, it had to become less radical. And so a lot of ways, the symbol that originated as gay pride has been turned into a PR tool or a marketing campaign. So each June, corporations turn their logos into rainbows. They make lots of money. But you can be left asking, where are those same corporations when state governments come to dismantle LGBTQ rights? The truth is, July comes around and the rainbows disappear. Despite the cliches, there's not always a rainbow at the end of every storm. LGBTQ folks were among the communities that the Nazis targeted first because they knew that doing so would help them win votes, by unifying segments of the conservative right who might not agree on anything else. Today, it's not a coincidence that we're seeing a resurgence of white nationalism, white supremacy, book banning, and the worst years on record for anti-LGBTQ legislation. In today's era of the Republicans Don't Say Gay bills, we need the pink triangle more than ever. If we are to truly honor those who originally wore the pink triangle, and I'm talking about those who had no choice but to wear it in the concentration camps, and those who chose to reclaim it as a badge of pride, we have to commit to action. The LGBTQ community has every right to exist today, and not just quietly in the closet, but visibly in high school curriculum, in history books, in TVs and movies. Every single way that we talk about the world, we have that right to be seen. But we have to fight to protect that right, because the pink triangle reminds us of what happens if we don't. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I would be happy to answer any questions or field any comments that you might have. Yes.
Was researching all of this very difficult for you to do, like, mentally?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the question. He asked if researching this was difficult mentally for me, and I, the group that I met with earlier, we were talking about this, about how it's difficult to sometimes separate yourself from the material that you're researching and writing about. And there were many stretches of times where I would have to set this material aside for 5 days a week and just binge watch Netflix, right? As a coping mechanism, because right, any history of the Holocaust is traumatic by its nature. But for me to be reading about people who were like me, or who were like my friends, right, my chosen family, knowing that if we had the misfortune of being born in Germany and living in the 1930s, that could have very well have been us, was a very deep burden to know. But I have to say that that's also what gave me the motivation to continue writing it, right? Because these people had no one else to tell their stories, right? That I, as a way to honor them, wanted to be able to put their names, put their life story on a page in a book that couldn't be taken away, right? These stories now, whether or not this gets banned, this book gets banned somewhere, their story will live on in other medium. So I would say that the hardest part of writing this was that moment when I was in the archives in Germany. Because on the one hand, it wasn't super surprising to me that the Nazis were homophobic, right? Like, I didn't know the details, but that idea was kind of like, okay, that seems like a pretty Nazi thing to do. But when I was in the archives, the very first document that I found that led me beyond 1945 was Bruno Brouchard's letter. And I first read it and thought, whew, this poor guy. You know, this is just a heartbreaking fluke of a story. But then I kept researching and I found more Brunos, more stories of men who managed to survive even though they were physically mutilated, but then were told time and again that they weren't worthy. I feel like that was the biggest hill for me to get over. And realize that democracy doesn't always mean equality. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah.
I know that you said that you went to the German archives and how in the past that they were like destroying some of the evidence. Were there any of the current ones trying to like not give you any information about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, again, just repeating the question, when I started, my research is, were there any archives that were trying to stonewall me, essentially? Yeah, especially the big state archives. Number one, we're like, okay, here comes another American wanting to study the Holocaust. Like, is there no other part of German history that you want to study? But then, especially when you start asking for the paragraph 175 victims, you see archivists kind of clam up. And so I knew from a very early stage that I was not going to be able to rely on the big archives to tell the story. The archives that I used were small, volunteer, queer archives spread out across Germany and then across the U.S. To tell the U.S. portion of this story. And I'm talking about archives that are really garages, right? And people saying like, sure, you can come look through my archive, and you get there and it's like full of, everything's in Ziplocs or cardboard boxes. In fact, I'll tell one quick story. I found a website of this archive in Hanover. This was back before smartphones and Google Maps, and so I went to MapQuest.com, in case any of you remember that, and literally printed out the instructions, and I walked my way to this archive and was really confused because the address led me to an apartment complex. And I was like, oh my God, I'm in Germany, I'm lost, I don't know what to do. So I rang the doorbell that had the right address on it, and I went up, and this archive was this guy's apartment. And he had spent his entire life collecting and organizing and preserving, I'm talking rooms and rooms full of floor-to-ceiling material that no one else in the world had. And this guy, I could say, you know what, I'm really interested in what were people doing in Aachen, Germany, and he would be like, all right, I know where that is. He would just like go pull it off the shelf. And so I spent months at his kitchen table going through this material that otherwise would not have existed. And so that is the case for, I can speak personally for German and American history, but I can imagine for queer history all across the world. It's up to the queer community itself to document it, preserve it, and then help others like myself find material to be able to write a history when no one else would. Thank you. Yes.
Isn't it difficult for you to be a publicly queer figure? It's inherently dangerous. So just in that vein of you don't really know how people react to you at all, but you kind of have to because your work kind of inherently shows that.
Yeah. So the question was, do I find it difficult to be openly, gay at doing this work? And we were talking about that even at dinner tonight, this on the one hand, from an academic perspective, how you can't separate yourself from this material. I realized very early on that, in fact, it actually made my writing and my research better if I leaned into my identity, right? That it didn't make me a worse historian, it made me a better historian. But then comes the question that you raised about, it's different to be openly gay in the pages of a book that no one would know me, right? But then to get up on stage like this and talk about it and be open is really scary sometimes, especially I've started a family. I have a 1-year-old now, right, which completely changes how I think about everything. And I'll give one quick example to I guess exemplify this question. I grew up really closeted in a rural southern Georgia town, and I got out of there as quickly as I could, and I very rarely return. But lo and behold, when the book was published, my friend she became the librarian there, and she said, "Oh, we've got to have you back home to talk about your book." And my first reaction was, because I was afraid of running into people that were not kind to me, right? And what were we going to say then? But then I started thinking, what would teenage Jake want or need? I lived in that town and never saw myself reflected in any positive way in school, in the community center. So finally, I said, okay, yes, we'll do it. And, I don't want like a lot of advertisement, like not a lot of fanfare, but I'll come back. And this is one of those moments where you kind of have to slap yourself and say, like, Jake, remember the lessons that you're trying to teach other people. There was a person in the audience who dressed very conservatively, like he had a cowboy hat on and boots, and I was like, oh man, what is this guy doing here? Is he going to be the one to heckle me? Because he fit, at least I thought he fit into a box of a person who would not like me being openly gay. And in fact, he left, and I was like, okay, well, I guess there was too much gay Holocaust for him. But he came back in, and there was a fraction of a moment where I thought, did he go out to his truck and get a weapon? And so afterwards, though, this is where you have to just remind yourself, practice what you preach. Afterwards, he came up and said, I, my whole life, have been a bisexual man living in this town and never would have thought I would have seen a lecture like this here. And we stayed and chatted for 25 minutes and talked about his life and what it means to grow up queer in a rural town. And it was one of the most profound moments of this book tour so far. And in fact, it's because I wrote that book for people like him. So it also teaches me a lot, right, about how to check my own expectations or stereotypes of other people. So to get back to your question, yes, it still scares me sometimes, but I also think that it's important. Thank you. Yeah.
This kind of goes based off your last story, but do you have any advice for young queer adults that you wish you would have known when you were in your early 20s?
Yeah. It's that historian wanting a time machine, right, to go back and talk to your younger self. I would say find your people. And that's really hard sometimes, especially when being visible can be dangerous, right? There's a reason that sometimes small communities don't have a visible queer community because it's just not safe. And sometimes that visibility can actually be a threat. But there is many people that might not agree with, I hate that term, agree with your lifestyle, agree that you should exist is really what they're saying. There are people out there who will be your family. And I think having that courage to acknowledge who you are and then look for that same light in other people. I wish I could go back and tell my, teenage self that you've just got to look for that light in other people, because you know what, it's there, and make your own community, your own family. Yeah.
So kind of getting back to your research and archives,
I know. We went way off over here.
Kind of getting back to this archives deep dive that you had to do. I'm so baffled by this idea that I'm baffled by this idea anyways, but I'm baffled by the idea of German archives getting rid of this material. Number one, considering that archives is literally the whole point of this is to preserve information. I've gone into archives and seen traffic reports from 1962.
Yep.
And they're still here in 2023. Why on earth are we getting rid of this incredible material that is so potent and so necessary for this field of study? Was there a justification for this idea of, gay history not being worthy of archives?
I think that, I guess I'll go back to the mic. I'm normally in lecture mode and wandering around and being like Oprah up and down the aisles, but it was never, in some cases it was very explicit, like this archive saying we need more space for more archive-worthy material. But in a lot of cases it was never so explicitly stated, right? But it was an undercurrent of homophobia that did not treat queer history as worthy of study, of being told, of being acknowledged, or being taught. And in that case, this has not made a lot of friends in the history profession, but historians are complicit in the continued arrest and persecution of queer men under paragraph 175, because the only time that historians writing about the Holocaust in those early years of the 50s, 60s, 70s mentioned homosexuality was to say, you know what, I think a lot of the leading Nazis, and I'm quoting here, were homosexual perverts. Right? See, the only time that homosexuals were mentioned was that they were probably perpetrators or criminals or deviant. So when you have your trusted historians writing from the ivory tower that, under the Nazi rule, homosexuals were part of the problem, that doesn't force society or the lawmakers to think about why are we using a Nazi law in a democratic state, right? So their historians' silence on this, or shifted version of the truth, allowed the lawmakers to feel justified in using that law. So those part of the blame goes to those historians, right? And the fact that queer historians were going into these archives, finding it and trying to say, here, publish this. Let's tell the public about this. And museums were saying, nah, no one wants to learn about homosexuals. I know we're getting really close to time. But I'm not sure if any of you here are familiar with the play Bent, which was released in 1979. It was the very first really big account that talked about the experiences of gay men in the concentration camps. Martin Sherman was the writer. He had to go and do a lot of interviews and writing himself because there wasn't any scholarship on the topic. And when that play opened in Germany, one of the coolest things that I found in the archives was that the playbills for in German it was called the Pink Triangle. It wasn't called Bent. The playbills at the different theaters would have maybe one page that told, who the actors were, who the producer was, who the director was, and the rest of the 20 pages would be scholarly articles. Because those historians couldn't publish in journals, they wouldn't publish in the newspapers, so they found any outlet that they could, so that those people coming to watch Bent weren't just there to watch a play, they got access to that archival information. So when I say there was a silence around this, it was a very calculated silence. Queer people were shouting it from the rooftop, they were documenting it, they were writing it. The silence was imposed from the outside. How are we on time, Brian?
I think, it's up to you. You want to have some time to sign the book, but a couple more questions, say 2 questions.
All right, we've got time for 2 more questions. We're going to go here and then there.
You did your research well after the reunification of Germany, but you're going to talk a little bit about the difference between West Germany and East Germany and how they approached this history?
Yes, that's a big difference between East Germany and West Germany. As I mentioned, East Germany very quickly, when they within a matter of months of being established, they got rid of the Nazi version of paragraph 175. They did continue to enforce paragraph 175, that original version, but the numbers in comparison to West Germany are incredibly, incredibly low. Now, this is not, I was just kind of dumbfounded by this, and I was thinking, why are the numbers of arrests so low in this communist dictatorship, right? It kind of goes against the grain of what you might normally think. And in fact, in 1955, they just get rid of paragraph 175 altogether. Turns out, though, it was very calculated. They wanted, they weren't pro-gay rights, of course, but they wanted a gay subculture to emerge enough that they could put it under surveillance, right? So it was like a certain level of visibility, not only allowed other gay people to find them, their own community, visibility made it easier to spy on them and therefore control them. So there's a really great new book that just came out last year called States of Liberation by Samuel Huneke that really looks at the situation in East Germany. He just gives incredible stories from ordinary gay East Germans, but also from the East German government. So if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend checking it out. Thank you.
Why do you think that even today, with all these resources and all this knowledge available, people from the LGBTQ community still have to fight to even be recognized as human?
Can't wait to hear your answer.
So, I mean, that is the question, isn't it? And really not just for the queer community, but for all marginalized communities, especially those who are at the intersections of marginalization, queer and Black trans people, for example. You know, as a person, as an individual, I would like to try to remain, like say that I was hopeful, right, and say that we've seen a lot of progress, and in a lot of ways we have, but also as a historian, I'm just super cynical, right, because I've seen these types of trends before where there seems to be a lot of progress made, but then faced with a really violent backlash, and I think that we find ourselves in one of those backlashes right now. You know, on the one hand, I have even members of my own family who are like, what, you got married? You can get married? As if that's the measuring stick for equality and dignity and worth. You know, I've often been asked, kind of related to that question, like, do we need the pink triangle back? What's the relationship between the pink triangle and rainbows? Because we see rainbows everywhere. Like, gay people are everywhere. You have your own TV shows, right? And I find that visibility is not enough. Clearly, it's not enough for us to enjoy being treated equally as fully human. It's not enough for us to wave a rainbow flag and say, hey, we're here. That is why I personally find the pink triangle more powerful and more potent, right? I'm not canceling the rainbow flag. I've got one outside my house, all right? But it serves a different purpose. That serves a purpose of, hey, I'm here, and it sends a signal to maybe any other queer person walking by that you've got a friend in me. Right, but the pink triangle is a reminder to be vigilant, right? That in a democracy, you still have to fight for protections and be fought to be seen and be recognized as equal, right? That and just because you had progress, it's fragile, right? And that just because you have won certain rights, that doesn't mean that they can't be taken away, right? I think we've seen that with the Supreme Court recently. So to me, this symbol is a powerful reminder, again, that we always have to be proud in who we are, build that family, build that chosen family, but also be vigilant, because there are always going to be people out there who do not want us to exist. All right, on that wonderfully happy note, I would love to invite you, if you want to come pick up a copy of the book. We can continue our chat. And I just want to say that I really, really appreciate you coming out tonight. I always enjoy the conversation afterwards because I always learn something new from folks asking their questions. And so I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing this space with me tonight. Thank you.